Our scripture today comes from the book of Philippians, various verses from chapter 4. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable. If there is any excellence and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned for me, but had no opportunity to show it. Not that I am referring to being in need, for I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. And in any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well-fed and of going hungry, of having plenty and of being in need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Thank God for these special, special words.
All right. As I said, today we're continuing our sermon series. We're calling it So Extra. We started it just after Easter. And the idea of the series is pretty simple and straightforward. The idea is that Jesus was sent into the world. He lived, he died, and he rose again in order to add to our lives and not necessarily to take away. And that which Christ comes to add to our lives is a sense of joy and a sense of connection. And so we've been talking about what does it mean to cultivate that joy, that connection that Jesus has sent into the world that we might discover and see. And what we basically have discovered in the weeks leading up to this point is that the happiness and the joy that we're looking for doesn't come necessarily through work and doesn't come through stuff, and it doesn't come through necessarily pleasurable experiences, although these things are pretty good. They're not bad in and of themselves, but lasting joy doesn't come from these places. Instead, we learned that lasting joy comes through relationship, and specifically three relationships: relationship with God, and relationship with others, relationship with ourselves. And it's the quality of these relationships and how they intersect in our lives that leads to a sense of joy and well-being for us long term. Today I'm going to take it another step further, though. Rather than relationship with God, ourselves, and others, I'm going to talk about finding joy in relationship to our circumstances. And so I want to kind of see where you're at. We're going to vote again, Pastor Andy style. And so here's the vote we're going to do today. If you think it's possible to find joy despite circumstances, in a moment you can give me a thumbs up. If you are not quite sure, you can give me kind of the middle one. I mean, don't take that the wrong way. And then if you don't think so, thumbs down. All right, so here we go. Do you think it's possible to find joy despite circumstances? Yeah, thumbs up. You all kind of like the first service. All right, you're not really sure? Yeah. This is the Methodist group. We're always in between, right? And maybe your thumbs down. It's not a trick question. We all have a different way of answering this type of question, but it is ultimately, I think, the question we're all striving for, looking for. We're wanting to find a sense of joy, and there's this place in our soul, deep down within ourselves, that is always kind of searching for it. We're kind of like looking for our way back home. And so this has been such a wonderful series because in many ways it's been about finding our way back to that place called home, in which we find our center, our rest in God's presence. And as we think about that, let's begin with a moment of prayer, then we'll kind of jump in. God, we are thankful that you're with us today. Again, we're thankful for this time just to be here and be reminded of your holy presence, your sacred presence, always with us. And I do ask in these next moments that you would take the words of my mouth, and I pray that you would take the meditations of all of our hearts. And God, I ask that you would work in such a way that they would be made acceptable in your sight. I pray this in the name of Christ, who is our rock and redeemer. Amen. So I'm going to talk about 3 hurdles to finding joy despite circumstances today. Things that can get in our way from finding joy in the midst of our circumstances. And so I'm just going to jump right in. Here's the first hurdle. The first hurdle that a lot of times keeps us from finding joy in the midst of circumstances is this tendency. We all have it. We all do this. It's a human tendency that we all struggle with. It's the tendency, though, to try to control things that we cannot control. This is a huge joy stealer. It's a joy killer in our lives, if you will. We try to control things we cannot control. And every time what ends up inevitably happen when we do this is that it causes frustration and it causes anger and it causes a sense of discontentment in our lives. But yet here we are. We're constantly planning. We're putting our expectations upon our lives. And then when it doesn't happen, we get angry. And we get frustrated and we lose our sense of joy and well-being. This just in. There's a lot we can't control, though. That's the thing. We can't control our health. We can't control the economy. We can't control others. We can't control our kids, grandkids, spouses, you name it. Even in a sense, sometimes even ourselves, we can't control it. And so if we're going to spend all our time trying to control things we cannot control, we're not going to find a sense of joy. And in our lesson today, I think we find an antidote to this tendency we all have. Our lesson comes from Philippians, which is the most joyful letter, as far as I know, that Paul ever wrote. I mean, he is rejoicing about everything. It's like Paul got shot out of a positive cannon in this passage, in this letter. And here's the thing, though, about Philippians. He wrote all this stuff about joy. He wrote all this stuff about well-being. He wrote all this stuff about peace, or whatever you want to call it. He wrote all of this stuff, though, while he was in prison. It wasn't rainbows and unicorns for Paul when he wrote this. And what he does, though, is he gives us a pathway to that joy we're all looking for. And so in this first passage, I think what we find is the antidote to the tendency we have to trying to control things we cannot control, the antidote to getting out of this trap. Go ahead, Julie. This is what he says. He says, I've learned I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now, time out for a moment. This is one of those Hobby Lobby verses, right? I mean, this is on the wall of many a Christian bathroom because we've shopped at Hobby Lobby and we got this verse. And if we're not careful, we misinterpret what Paul's saying here. Just to be clear, and this is unfortunate how we use this verse. We have used this verse to say that if I just believe hard enough, if I just believe strong enough, if I just pray hard enough or sing hard enough or try hard enough, that God's going to give me whatever I want. But that's not what he's saying at all. Again, wrote it while he was in prison. Not all rainbows and unicorns. What Paul's talking about here is through God's strength within his life, he has learned the capacity and the adequacy to face his circumstances. His antidote to this control issue we all have is faith. And by faith, I mean here, we don't necessarily have all the answers, but as a Christian people, we trust that no matter what the circumstances may be, that God will bring about new life. Here's the epiphany, though, with that phrase, new life. The guarantee of new life doesn't mean that it's going to get better. It just means it's going to be different. So much of the time, we as Christians think that it's just going to be this ongoing progress to bliss, and then we die and we go to heaven. But you and I both know that's not our experiences as we follow Jesus. You know, and I know that we've tried hard. We've done what we believe is the right thing to do. We've come to church. We prayed. We sang. We said all the prayers. We've received all the sacraments. We've done everything that we think is right. And yet it doesn't always get better. Sometimes it feels like it's like one step forward and 2 steps back. And so when we as Christians say that we're an Easter people, when we as Christians say that there's new life right around the corner, it doesn't mean it's going to get better. But what it does mean is it's going to be different. And in the different, we can trust that by the grace of God, we can get through it. maybe that's not the message to joy that you were looking for today. It's the truth. So, first hurdle we need to get over, control. Remedy to that, faith. Second hurdle, comparison and competition. Comparison and competition. We get ourselves in some circumstances, or we find ourselves in some circumstances, and inevitably as people, what do? We compare ourselves with other people, and we say to ourselves, if I only had it like that, then I would be okay. If I only had it like them, then it would be okay. You know, if I had the money that they had, or if my kids behaved like their kids did, or the economy would go my way, or whatever it may be, we start seeing what other people, what we perceive as what they have, and we compare ourselves against them. And as we compare ourselves against them, inevitably, that steals our joy. Let's see what Paul's antidote to this tendency is. Next verse. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, honorable, just, pure, pleasing, commendable. Next verse. If there's anything excellent or worthy of praise, think about that. Again, this is one of those Hobby Lobby verses that we plaster on our walls. But it wasn't all rainbows and unicorns for Paul when he wrote this, folks. He was in prison. He had probably been beaten. Tradition tells us he eventually was executed. It didn't all go his way. What's his antidote to comparison and competition? If I was going to throw a word at that, gratitude. Which, quite frankly, is probably the most subversive thing we can do when a circumstance or a person is actively trying to steal the joy from us. Think about it. I'm not going to allow you to steal the joy from me, circumstance. I'm not going to allow you to steal the joy from me, person in my life. I'm going to cultivate a sense of gratitude anyway. I'm not going to steal my joy. And that's precisely what Paul's doing as he's sitting in that prison. Not going to steal my joy. I'm going to cultivate a sense of gratitude. Whatever's true and pure and pleasing and good, I'm going to find it. I'm going to stick to it. I'm going to hold on to it. You're not going to take it from me. You're not going to steal it from me. This is what it means to live faithfully even in the midst of it. Whatever it is, it may be that we find ourselves in the midst of. Think about it this way. Last week I told a story about a lady who said something in a class that we're in right now that really spoke to me. It was actually a grief share group, and we were talking about the inner dialogue that we all have within ourselves all the time, and whether it's positive or a negative inner dialogue that we're having. And in the midst of it, a lady says that she believes that if it's a voice of pain and confusion that we hear, that it's not of God. Now, I shared that story last week with not only church, but also a Bible study I was in, and someone, a good friend of mine, pushed against it. And she said, Andy, the problem is, though, we always have pain and confusion in our lives. And she's right. We do always have pain and confusion in our lives. The question becomes, though, how are we going to respond to it? And the way that we respond to the pain and confusion we all experience in our lives, it does determine our overall long-term well-being. We can become cynical and bitter and give in to the pain and confusion, or we can become grateful even in the midst of it. And ultimately, it is gratitude that guards our heart from losing a sense of joy despite the circumstances we find ourselves in. Last hurdle. We get stuck in the past or the future. We think back to the past and we tell ourselves, if I would have done this or I would have done that, then everything would be different. Or we get lost in the future thinking, maybe it'll all come together and I'll be okay. Paul's remedy to that, well, let's look at the last verse I'll share today. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Again, it's one of those Hobby Lobby verses. Again, it's one of those passages that can get reinterpreted and misinterpreted over and over again. I think sometimes we as Christians have told ourselves this is the way we're supposed to be, in the sense we're always supposed to be happy, and have plastic smiles and like it's A-okay. But again, you have to understand, when Paul wrote this, not rainbows and unicorns, sitting in a Roman prison. So what did he mean when he said, rejoice in the Lord always then? This is the epiphany that I've had in working on this sermon series the last few weeks. The epiphany is this: happiness is not the same as joy. It's different. Happiness is what happens when you reach a goal, you get what you want, things go your way. That's happiness. And we all want happiness, and I hope for you that you have happiness. Joy, though, is different. Joy is about connection. It's about a connection with God, connection with others, connection with yourself. But in this context, according to Paul, it's all about a connection with God. How do we get through life despite circumstances? We realize our connection with God no matter how we may or may not feel. Pastor Andy's reinterpretation of this verse would be, realize your connection with God. I will say it again. Realize your connection with God. You might feel up. You might feel down. Life might be going great. All hell might be breaking loose. No matter how we feel, the calling is a simple one. We trust in our connection. Our connection with the reality that's always been with us the entire time. And as we trust in that connection, what do? We know that no matter what we may be facing, new life is always around the corner. That presence, that Lord, that God that Paul talks about we have a connection with, brings about new life. Now, it might not be better all the time. It might be different. And yet it is in the midst of that different, what do? We find something to be grateful for anyway. This is grown-up faith. This is what it means in a lot of ways to be a grown-up. You might not get what you want. You might not have the life that you chose for yourself. You might not be in the place that you want to be. Sorry. I don't think Paul was either. And yet it is in the midst of that, what can we do? Trust in that connection that is the most real thing about us anyway. Making that connection known and real is what Holy Communion is all about. And so in these next moments, let us experience that connection together.